Look, it's no secret that Notre Dame has not gotten enough production out of its wide receiver room the past couple of years, but could that all change in 2024? That's coming right up.
You are Locked On Irish, your daily podcast on the Notre Dame Fighting Irish, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is up, and welcome into Locked On Irish, your daily Notre Dame podcast. Today is Thursday, July 11th, and thank you for starting your day right here by making this your first listen of the day. I'm your host, Tyler Wojciak. I'm a Notre Dame alum and producer at Fox Sports, and as always, you can watch this episode as well as every other episode on YouTube, or you can listen wherever you get your podcasts. If you are watching along today, this is a reminder to please like the video below by hitting that thumbs up button and subscribe to the channel, or if you're listening to the podcast, please rate, review, and subscribe. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. As playoffs wind down, the sports stop sporting like we want them to, but this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day all summer long. Just visit FanDuel.com to get started. Okay, I'm excited to be back with you today, and I've got a fun show in store. I'll admit, the last couple episodes were not as fun and a little bit negative in light of Ivan Taylor's flip to Michigan, as well as some uncertainty about other top prospects on Notre Dame's recruiting board. But I covered that already this week. I also had recruiting analyst Eric Thomas from Irish Illustrated on yesterday's show to break that all down. So if you want more recruiting coverage, go ahead and listen to that if you haven't listened to that already. Check them out. But today, I'm going to do a deep dive into the Notre Dame wide receiver room, which is always an interesting topic, but specifically this season, right? Because there is no position on the roster that has experienced as much turnover this offseason than the wide receivers. Like, remember way back in December when Rico Flores, Braylon James, and Tobias Merriweather all entered the transfer portal in the first week after the regular season, and everyone was losing their minds? Some people went so far to say that Notre Dame was in a state of catastrophe. Well, a lot has changed since then, in part due to Marcus Freeman's efforts in their transfer portal, and now I believe that this wide receiver group is going to be the most improved position on the roster in 2024. Now, granted, it's a pretty low bar to clear because they were pretty dreadful as a collective last season. Let's go through the numbers. So Notre Dame's leading wide receiver in 2023 was Chris Tyree. And this is not meant to be shade on Chris Tyree, who has since left to play closer to home back in Virginia for his last year of college football. I really liked what Chris Tyree did in his one and only season playing wide receiver for Notre Dame. But he was the most productive wide receiver on the roster last year. He finished with 26 receptions, 484 yards, and 3 touchdowns. That was Notre Dame's leading wide receiver on the team. If you were to compare that nationally, Chris Tyree's 26 receptions were 420th in the country, and he finished 233rd in receiving yards with 484. That is not going to cut it for your number one wide receiver. Again, it's probably not fair for me to single out Chris Tyree, so let's look at the collective numbers from Notre Dame's wide receivers last year. They had, in total, 131 receptions, 2,143 receiving yards, and 18 touchdowns. Okay, so for context, these are the numbers that Golden Tate put up by himself back in 2009, the season that he won the Blitnikoff Award. 93 receptions, 1,496 yards, and 15 receiving touchdowns. That's one person with just 38 less receptions than the entire Notre Dame receiving corps put up last season. Just over 600 receiving yards less and 30 touchdowns less than Notre Dame's entire receiving room. Now, I will say that was probably the greatest single season that any Notre Dame wide receiver has ever had, at least statistically, in the history of the school. So maybe it's a little bit unfair to take the best season ever and compare it to last season when it was obviously a big weakness on the team. But still, that is just one singular player. And sure, you're not going to have a Golden Tate every single season, but Notre Dame has had some really great wide receivers come through the program in recent years, including Michael Floyd, who played alongside Golden Tate, Jeff Samardzija, Maurice Stovall, Raymond McKnight before him. They also had Will Fuller, TJ Jones, Tavares Daniels. All of these guys are really good college receivers, and it feels like an eternity since Notre Dame had a wide receiver one, even though they had Chase Claypool back in 2019, who was really good and a true wide receiver one. That was the last time Notre Dame had a guy like that. So Notre Dame was very active in the transfer portal this offseason. They added Bo Collins from Clemson, Chris Mitchell from Florida International, and Jaden Harrison from Marshall, all in the transfer portal to replace Tobias Merriweather, Braylon James, and Rico Flores Jr. And to be clear, I really liked Rico Flores. I loved his game. I love his toughness. I love the tenacity that he played with. And that is, without a doubt, a loss to this room. Braylon James and Tobias Merriweather, I feel a little bit differently about them compared to Rico Flores Jr. I am so excited to not have to talk about Tobias Merriweather anymore on this podcast. And that is no shame to him as a person or as an individual. Like, this isn't about him. It's more so the discourse in the Notre Dame fan base about Tobias Merriweather. Like, I just got a little tired of watching him not give 100% effort when he was out there and had his opportunity to make plays, while simultaneously having to listen to some people think that he wasn't given enough chances at Notre Dame. Like, there was just too much going on in that conversation. Now he's at Cal. We don't have to deal with that any longer. So if you look at what Notre Dame added, Collins, Mitchell, and Harrison, they were very productive at their previous schools. Collins, maybe not so much as Mitchell. Now, granted, he played for Clemson as opposed to Florida International. Last season, Collins put up 38 receptions, 510 yards, 3 touchdowns. Chris Mitchell had a big season at FIU. 64 receptions, 1,118 receiving yards, and 7 touchdowns. And then Jaden Harrison had a modest 28 receptions for 410 yards and a touchdown for Marshall, but I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that Marshall's quarterback was terrible, and Jaden Harrison was an All-American kick returner, so we know that he is dynamic with the ball in his hands. They also have some young guys who are developing and could blossom to be really, really good players starting this season, including Jaden Greathouse, who's going to be a true sophomore, and then Jordan Faison as well, who really came out of nowhere in the second half of last season. And then they also have Jane Thomas, who's not a young player. He's going to be entering his senior season, but technically a redshirt junior eligibility-wise. And those 3 guys, I'm expecting big steps from every single one of them, so long as they're healthy, because Jaden Greathouse was dealing with a hamstring injury, as well as Jane Thomas. I think Thomas is extremely underrated. He might be the most underrated player on the entire roster for Notre Dame. He was their best receiver going into last season, started hot out of the gates, had 4 receptions in the first 3 games, and then suffered a hamstring injury against Ohio State, and then he caught he just caught 5 passes in the last 7 games of the regular season. But then he came back for the Sun Bowl looking fresh and healthy, had a really good game. 4 receptions, 59 yards, and a touchdown, and Notre Dame was feeding them the ball early and often. So you have all these different options that can do a bunch of different things for you, which makes me really excited about the group as a whole. I also think about Jordan Faison and what he could be now that he's already played a full season of college football under his belt, and he had, 115 receiving yards, and he won the Sun Bowl MVP. So there's just a bunch of different guys who can do different things for you. And then there's some young guys who are looking to crack the rotation this year, including Micah Gilbert, who's going to be a true freshman, early enrollee, had 2 touchdowns in the spring game, might have been one of the most impressive freshmen in spring practice for the Irish this year. And then KK Smith, who was kind of forgotten about in that receiver class the year prior because, like I said, Braylon James left the program, Rico Flores left the program, Jane Greathouse was one of Notre Dame's most productive receivers last year, and all the while, KK Smith sat out for the entire season because he had shoulder surgery before the season started, but he looked really good in the spring as well. So they have all these different guys, and now it's just a matter of where are they going to fit? How are they going to fit in the rotation? Like, I don't really know how the depth chart is going to shake out. This is my guess, but right now I would have Jaden Thomas at the boundary, Chris Mitchell at the field receiver, and Jane Greathouse at slot receiver. Those would be my first 3, but even that I don't feel super confident about because I don't necessarily believe that Jaden Thomas wants to play boundary. I think that in his mind, he's better off playing the slot, but Notre Dame has a bunch of true slot receivers like Jaden Greathouse, Jordan Faison, Jaden Harrison, and Logan Saldate, the incoming freshman who just joined the team this summer. And then behind those 3, I think you have Jordan Faison is going to be the first guy off the bench. He can play slot. He can play field. Bo Collins, the transfer. He is probably the true boundary receiver that Notre Dame doesn't really have other than Deion Colzie. More on him in a bit. I don't really know what to make of him. But like from a pure physical standpoint, Bo Collins is the boundary receiver. So maybe he could end up starting, but if Jaden Thomas is willing to play in that spot, I think he will start. He's been more productive for Notre Dame, at least, considering Collins is a transfer. And then Jaden Harrison is going to be off the bench as well. I think he's going to be an interesting player who could be used in different situations, maybe on some like end arounds and things like that, because he is just so fast and so quick in short spaces. You're going to want to get him the ball. And then rounding out that group, I've got Micah Gilbert and Deion Colzie. Gilbert can play the boundary. He can play the field. I don't think he's going to play slot because they already have enough there. And then, like I said, Deion Colzie, I don't really know what to do with him because he's going to be entering his senior season, and he scored a touchdown in that Navy game, and then he missed the rest of the season due to injury. And I just feel like He came on strong his freshman year, had some moments where like, hey, he's making some good plays. And then at the end of the 2022 season, he was like Notre Dame's most consistent third down threat. And you thought, okay, now he's going to be able to build on that going into next season. And it just didn't happen. So he is an enigma to me. I don't really know what to make of him. He is a veteran presence. He's an older guy in that room. So that's helpful. But I don't really know how he fits in the rotation. And Mike Brown, Notre Dame's wide receivers coach, has said that he likes to have a rotation of 6 to 7 guys, which to me feels a little bit short, probably 1 or 2 guys short. I think 8 is a number that you should be shooting for, especially with all the different options that Notre Dame has in this room. But when you look at all the guys that they have, the talent that they bring, the production that they had before the season, whether it was at a different school or at Notre Dame, I really like what Notre Dame has in this group, and I'm feeling cautiously optimistic about the Notre Dame wide receiver room because last year I felt a lot better about the receivers. They did not prove me right at all. It was another really down year for the group, but I feel confident in saying that going into 2024, the wide receivers are going to be the most improved position group on the roster because of all the different options that they have. But even though they have a bunch of different options, I am concerned about the lack of a true wide receiver one. Like, who are they going to be able to count on big situations? I'll tell you why they might have one emerge halfway through the season right after this. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. I love sports. I love them so much that I never want them to stop. But as the playoffs wind down, we get fewer games, and the sports aren't sportsing like I want them to. But FanDuel lets me keep the sports going whenever I want. All I have to do is open the app and dream up bets anytime I'm in the mood. In the summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. So head over to FanDuel.com/lockedon and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. So as we dive a little bit deeper into the Notre Dame wide receiver room, I've already established that I think they're going to be much improved from the year before. But my biggest concern about them is, despite the fact that they have all these different options, do they have a true wide receiver one? And when you look at the strengths and you look at the weaknesses, I think it all kind of blends together, right? Like, I love the versatility of this group. Guys can move around, play different positions, and I think that is going to be something that Notre Dame utilizes early and often in the season to make up for the fact that they don't have a true wide receiver one. Like Mike Denbrock, for as good of an offensive coordinator as he is, it was probably a lot easier when he was game planning as the offensive coordinator at LSU when he had Malik Neighbors and Brian Thomas Jr. as his wideouts. Like, he also had Jane Daniels, the eventual Heisman Trophy winner, as his quarterback. Like, he can just send those guys in a go route, and odds are one of them is going to get open. Both of those guys were drafted in the first round of this most recent NFL draft. It's going to be a much different situation for him this season at Notre Dame. But he can move guys around in different spots so that he can create mismatches. And that is like the core of the Mike Denbrock offense, finding mismatches against the defense with individual matchups. And Notre Dame has a bunch of different guys, as I mentioned, that you can move around and create mismatches with the defense. You could put Jaden Greathouse in the slot. You can split him out wide. You can put Jaden Thomas in the slot, and then he's basically like a quicker tight end out there. Jaden Harrison and Jordan Faison are absolute burners, and if they get a linebacker or even a safety lined up on them, they could beat them and find some open space for a touchdown at any point in the game. So he has a lot of different tools to play with. But who is Notre Dame going to count on when you absolutely need a catch? Think back to Notre Dame, Virginia Tech 2019. 4th and 10, Notre Dame's on the Virginia Tech 33-yard line. They're down 6 with under a minute left. They've been driving. They have to score a touchdown to basically save the season and really save themselves from a ton of animosity from the fan base. Like the week prior, they'd gotten absolutely smacked by Michigan. Morale was not high among Notre Dame fans and the team at that time. They were under a lot of criticism, and now they're in another do-or-die situation against Virginia Tech. So it's 4th down. They have to convert here. And everyone in the stadium, everyone who's watching the game on television knew where the ball was going. It was going to Chase Claypool because that was Notre Dame's best receiving option all throughout the 2019 season. He had a really, really great year that year. Virginia Tech knows that. They had a corner lined up over top of him as well as a safety playing a little bit deep. Now the cornerback just turned and ran backwards as soon as Notre Dame took the snap. But 4th and 10, Claypool runs like a deep dig route. Ian Book hits him right over the middle, catches it, 1st down. Notre Dame continues the drive, and then they end up scoring on that Ian Book rushing play when he shushed his own crowd. One of the weirdest moments in recent Notre Dame history. But my point is that even though everyone in the stadium knew where the ball was going to, Chase Claypool was there, ran a great route, created separation for himself, and made the 1st down. Now think if Notre Dame was in that exact same position against Texas A&M in the season opener. Who's going to get their number called? It might be Mitchell Evans, the tight end, But I'd much rather it be a wide receiver who can just create some separation, because I like Mitchell Evans, but he's not a burner. Odds are he's going to have a linebacker or a safety, someone draped all over him, and it's going to be a difficult throw for Riley Leonard to kind of fit it into a tight window. Now, don't get me wrong, Mitchell Evans can create some mismatches, but in a situation like this, you really need a wide receiver to go out there and make a play. Someone is going to get their number called because they have to call it to someone, right? It could be Jane Thomas. It could be Greathouse. It could maybe even be Chris Mitchell, but we don't know because none of these guys have proven that they can be that guy yet. And this might be unfair to Jane Thomas because, like I said, he was going to be Notre Dame's wide receiver 1 going into last season. And then he got hurt in that Ohio State game, and that just kind of completely derailed things. But when you saw Sam Hartman and Jane Thomas work together in the spring and then early on in the season, you could see a very positive connection between those two guys. And then once that went away, the Notre Dame had to rely on their freshmen, Jane Greathouse and Rico Flores. And it was good in a way for their development because they're on the field making plays, but they just weren't ready for that kind of situation. Then Jane Greathouse gets hurt, and it was just a bad situation all the way around. This year, Notre Dame is going to need a wide receiver 1 to step up and make a play when it matters most. And I'm not sure it's going to happen right away, but I think that as the season goes on, Jaden Greathouse is going to solidify himself as a true wide receiver 1 option for Notre Dame. I don't know which game it's going to be when he fully breaks out and you're like, okay, that's the guy that Notre Dame is going to go to on third down. So when they absolutely need a big catch, who is it going to be? I think it's going to be Jane Greathouse. Now, one great thing about this room, as I mentioned before already, is the versatility. Like, there's a good chance that Notre Dame has a different leading wide receiver in their first 6 games. Like, Thomas could do it, Mitchell, Collins, every single one of these guys is capable of having a big game and being that wide receiver for that specific game. But I think as the season goes along, guys are going to start to separate themselves, and I believe that Jaden Greathouse is going to be the one who separates himself from the rest of the group. We saw how good he was in high school. He was putting up record numbers at one of the best high school football programs in the state of Texas at the highest level of competition. He starts his college career, scores 2 touchdowns in his very first game, and still has 5 receiving touchdowns in his freshman season, despite the fact that he missed a few games entirely due to injury. You started to hear some really positive things about him in the spring. The fact that he can move around also makes him a guy that's really hard to take off the field because he can play slot, play field. Hell, they could even put him in boundary if they need to, because I think they did that a few times last year. So I really feel good about what Jaden Greathouse can do and when he's going to do it. I just don't know if he's going to be that guy right away. So another strength about this room that I think is going to come into play in that situation is their veteran presence. Chris Mitchell is going to be in his 6th year playing college football. Jane Harrison is also going to be a 6th year senior. Jane Thomas is going to be a senior. Collins is a senior. And Deion Colsey is a senior. That is a lot of college football played between 5 guys. Even though they haven't really been around long, especially at Notre Dame, these guys understand what it takes to succeed at college football. Again, Colsey, who knows with him, but I like what Notre Dame has in that room. So early on in the season, as Greathouse continues to develop and shine and emerge as a future star, I think they're going to have to rely a lot on their veterans early on. But then they have those other young guys who could break out as well. I mentioned Jordan Faison. Came out of nowhere in the second half of last season, won the Sun Bowl MVP, and just an electric player to watch. He is so fast. And then you watch him on the lacrosse team as Notre Dame went back-to-back. He's a true freshman playing on a team that is the defending national champion and was one of the most dynamic players in the field. I don't know much about lacrosse, but I can watch Jordan Faison say, that dude is just different. The way he moves, how elusive he is, he's just really hard for other guys to keep up with. So he could have a breakout season as well. And then there's Micah Gilbert. Unlike the freshman last season, Micah Gilbert doesn't have to play. Notre Dame has a bunch of guys in front of him, so they aren't going to be relying on him to come in and make big plays in big situations. And that is great, because that is a lot of pressure on a freshman wide receiver, and that could set them up for failure, which then hurts their confidence and could have a negative effect on their career, even though it's a good thing that they're out there earning playing time. Micah Gilbert can earn his playing time with his play, and I think he's going to. I think he's really, really talented. That's why he had 2 touchdowns in the spring game. He came into the college really ready to go physically, and I think we're going to start to see that, especially as the season goes along. So Notre Dame has a ton of talent in this room. They have guys who can move around, and they can put guys in situations to have success. But my biggest concern is always going to be, who is that wide receiver 1 until someone steps up and proves that they can do it. Again, I feel confident it could be Jaden Greathouse. I could be wrong. It could be Jane Thomas. Maybe Chris Mitchell surprises me. I mean, I look at his numbers and what he did at Florida International last year, and sometimes I feel like I'm underrating him because he was doing it against inferior competition. But maybe he just continues on that trajectory and was like, hey, I've been playing college football for 5 years now. I have what it takes to play at this level. And he ends up having a really big season for the Irish. I feel optimistic, like I said, cautiously optimistic about the group as a whole. If I were to say another weakness, I would just say the history, which isn't even fair to this group. It's just hard for me to get over the fact that the wide receivers ever since 2019 have just been really rough. Like, you look at 2020, Javon McKinley was pretty good, but overall they were meh. I mean, Ben Skoranek was solid. Avery Davis came up big when he needed to. 2021, Kevin Austin was really good. Everyone else was just okay. And then 2022 and 2023 were just abysmal from the Notre Dame wide receivers. So if this is the year they finally get back on track and start producing at a high level, I have a ton of confidence about what this team can do in the future. And I'm going to talk about that future coming up right after this. As we talk about the Notre Dame wide receivers in 2024, I also think it's interesting to think about how this season will impact the future of the Notre Dame wide receiver room, because I think that what happens this season is going to go a long way in determining how much this group continues to improve over the course of the next couple of years. So I'll break down what I mean. So for starters, Bo Collins, Chris Mitchell, and Jane Harrison, the three transfers, are the only guys who are going to exhaust their eligibility after the season. Everyone else can come back. Even Deion Colsey, he has another year because he redshirted last season. Jane Thomas is another year as well. Greathouse is going to be back. Faison Gilbert. All of those guys will be back next season. Now, I will say, odds are at least a couple of these guys in the entire room are going to enter the transfer portal. It could be some of the freshmen too, because wide receivers transfer so much in college football. Like, I know every position experiences turnover in the transfer portal, but wide receivers, DBs, running backs, most of all. So odds are you're going to see some guys leave after the season once they realize, hey, they're at the bottom of the depth chart. So Notre Dame is always going to be aggressive in the transfer portal for that same reason, specifically at wide receiver. They also should have more money to spend because they won't have to pay a quarterback next year, or at least that's the hope by literally everyone in and around the programs. Also, you've got guys like Cam Williams, who I haven't even talked about at all on this show, and he was the high 4-star, borderline 5-star recruit from last year's class, who probably is not going to be an impact player this season, but I think he's going to take a big leap and be a very impactful player next season just because he has so much raw ability. He just has to sort of figure out how to play receiver at the college level, work on his technique, fundamentals, all of that, but expect big things from him next season. The freshmen and sophomores are going to be a lot of fun. Really excited about what they can do. But what about the recruits coming in? This has been a big topic of conversation this week. I've already talked about it on the show a lot already, and I've said multiple times, I look at the receiver position as the biggest weakness in Notre Dame's class of 2025. Right now, they only have two guys committed. They have Elijah Burris, and they have Jerome Bettis Jr., and Jerome Bettis Jr. could end up on defense. So they have one 3-star commit who you're like, this guy will certainly play wide receiver when he gets to college. And I like Elijah Burris. I mean, hell, his dad's Plaxico Burris. He's got to be pretty good, right? Now, Notre Dame is in the running for 3 receivers: Derek Meadows, Dylan Robinson, and Tanook Hines. Derek Meadows actually announced on Wednesday that he is going to make his college decision official on Saturday. And yesterday when I talked to Eric Thomas, he made it seem like Notre Dame was probably third in the race for Derek Meadows. But then on Wednesday, there has been some momentum on message boards, and depending on who you talk to, different rumors that are being heard out there, like maybe Notre Dame is actually in the running for Derek Meadows, and they have a shot to get his commitment when he announces on Saturday. Again, there's a lot that can change between now and then, which is pretty puzzling to me. Like, I don't understand why these high school kids make commitment dates and don't already have their decision made. Like, it seems like you're putting pressure on yourself because you set this date, even though you're not entirely sure about where you're going to go. So anyway, Derek Meadows is announcing Saturday, or at least that is the plan. The other two guys, Dylan Robinson, Tanook Hines, they're going to make their decisions official in the next week. Robinson is, right now, it seems like he's 50-50. Could be Notre Dame, it could be Washington. UCLA is also in the mix, I think, as well. But I think in the end, it's going to come down to one of those two schools. I think if he wants to play wide receiver, he'll go to Notre Dame. If he wants to play defense, if he thinks that's his best path to make the NFL, then he's probably going to go to Washington because he is a two-way player. Washington and UCLA like him at safety. Notre Dame likes him at wide receiver. So I think in the end, it's probably just going to come down to that. Tanook Hines at one point was considered a Notre Dame lean. I think there were even some crystal balls projected that had Hines going to Notre Dame, but at this point it seems like he's going to end up at USC. And honestly, I'm okay with it. I think out of these three guys, Derek Meadows, Dylan Robinson, Sinook Hines, Hines is third on that list. If Notre Dame is able to land Derek Meadows, that would be absolutely massive for the receiver room and the class as a whole, because I think Meadows is the type of player that Notre Dame just really struggles to land. Meadows has freakish size and athletic ability. He's 6'5", a true boundary receiver that, as I've mentioned on this podcast already, Notre Dame doesn't really have. So they could really benefit from getting Derek Meadows in this class. Like last year, I really liked the incoming freshmen with Williams, Saldate, and Mikey Gilbert. None of those guys have the combination of size and speed that Derek Meadows has. So we're all going to wait and see. We'll talk about what he decides next week on the show, but they really need Dylan Robinson. Like, they need someone. And even though they still have time, if they go 0 for 3 on these guys, like, there's still just under 5 months left until the early signing period. So it is possible that they could add a really good player late in the game. It's happened before. Notre Dame swung and missed on Will Shipley at running back a few years ago, and then they had to basically start over with running back recruiting, and then they added Logan Diggs and Audric Esme. So it's worked out before, but obviously it's not ideal. There are quality receivers everywhere in college football. That's the truth of the matter. So there's going to be guys available in the portal. There's going to be guys who Notre Dame can get. And that's really why it's been so frustrating that Notre Dame just hasn't had any production at the position over the past couple of years, because there are, like, you look at random schools all across the country and you watch a receiver like, who is that dude? How is he making plays? How is he making these catches? How is he getting open on Notre Dame's DBs, and yet Notre Dame's wide receivers can't get open against Duke? Like, it doesn't make sense to me. It didn't make sense to me at the time, but I don't think that's going to be the case in the future, because I think Notre Dame is going to continue to be aggressive in the transfer portal. But the amount of talent that they can get out of the transfer portal is probably going to depend on what the offense does this season. The same could be said about high school recruiting. I think Notre Dame really struggles to get elite wide receivers because they look at what Notre Dame has done at the wide receiver position over the last decade plus, even with Chase Claypool. Like, you go back to Will Fuller, who's a really, really great receiver for Notre Dame. Since then, they just have not had that many really good college receivers, and especially at guys who've gone on to be really impactful in the NFL. It just hasn't really happened at Notre Dame. So until they produce at a high level on the field on Saturdays in the fall, Notre Dame is going to have some difficulties getting these guys out of the portal and on the trail. So that is why I think this year is so important, and what Notre Dame does offensively is going to have such a big impact on what they're able to do in the future. There's going to be a lot of eyes on the Notre Dame offense this year, from quarterbacks, skill positions everywhere across the country. Like, if Notre Dame and Mike Denbrock, as the new offensive coordinator, if they can really create a dynamic offense that's fun, they're attacking downfield, they're getting their wide receivers open, they're making big plays in big games, then all of a sudden the position becomes that much more attractive to top targets in the portal and on the recruiting trail. It just hasn't happened in recent years. So I think that these guys look at Notre Dame and they're like, do I really want to go to a place where we're going to run it 50 times a game, or where their best receiver is Chris Tyree, and he's not even really a receiver. He was a running back the year before, and now he's at Virginia. And I went over the stats earlier in the show. He wasn't even the top 200 in like any statistical category when you compare him to other receivers across the country. So that is a real problem that Notre Dame is facing. They added good players in the transfer portal like Collins, Harrison, and Chris Mitchell. I think they're all going to be productive this year. Same with Greathouse, Thomas, Faison, all the guys I mentioned earlier. But they need big years out of really the collective. They were so bad last year. If they can have a really good room this year and a couple guys emerge as like potential stars, like a Jaden Greathouse, I think you're going to start to see a lot more really talented prospects coming out of high school and in the transfer portal consider Notre Dame in a way they just haven't been in recent years. It's going to be a really interesting story to watch this season, and it's kind of interesting how this year and what Notre Dame's offense does is going to have a direct impact on how they play in the future, because of the type of talent that they're going to be able to acquire because of it. But that is going to do it for me today, and that is another week of Locked On Irish in the books. I'm going to be back on Tuesday of next week to talk about Derek Meadows' decision, some other recruiting stuff, and we'll continue gearing up for fall camp, because as of this recording, we are just 3 weeks away from the start of fall camp. It's getting close, people. It really is, and I am so excited to cover this team all season long. I've got some really exciting stuff in store for you, especially as we get closer to the season, so make sure that you subscribe on YouTube or wherever you're listening to the podcast. I hope you have a great weekend, everybody. I'll see you next week.